The champagne had barely settled in the crystal flutes when Araminta Vance, now Lady Croft, rose from her gilded chair and tapped a silver dessert spoon against her glass. The grand dining hall of Oakhaven Manor fell silent. 200 guests turned their powdered faces toward the bride. Sunlight poured through the tall arched windows and lit up every pearl sewn into Araminta's ivory wedding gown. She looked radiant, she looked victorious, and she looked directly at Genevieve. Before we carry on with the afternoon's festivities, Araminta began, her voice carrying the sweet melody of a woman who had rehearsed every word. I wish to honor someone very dear to my heart. Genevieve Vance sat near the far end of the second table, not the family table, the second one, between the vicar's elderly mother and a retired colonel who had fallen asleep against his own walking stick. She had been placed there on purpose, of course. Everything today had been on purpose. My elder sister, Araminta continued, pressing a gloved hand to her chest, as though overcome with emotion. My dear, sweet Genevieve, would you come forward? A murmur swept through the room. Genevieve felt every pair of eyes land on her like stones dropped into still water. She set down her fork quietly. The bite of roasted pheasant she had been chewing suddenly tasted like chalk. She knew this feeling. She had known it since she was 14, and Araminta was 9, standing in their mother's parlor, already learning how to smile while she twisted the knife. Genevieve rose. Her dress was modest, a deep plum silk she had purchased second-hand from a cheapside dressmaker and altered herself. The stitching was flawless, naturally, because Genevieve's hands never produced anything less. But next to the sea of French lace and imported satin that filled this room, she might as well have been wearing a flour sack. She walked the length of the dining hall with her chin level and her back straight. 33 years of living as the elder, unmarried, professionally employed Van's sister had taught her many things. Chief among them, never let them see you flinch. There she is, Araminta beamed, reaching out to clasp Genevieve's hands as though they were the closest of confidants. Her grip was too tight. It was always too tight. I have a gift for you, dear sister. A footman stepped forward, carrying a cloth-draped object on a mahogany tray. Araminta pulled the cloth away with a theatrical flourish. It was a silver spinning wheel, miniature, ornamental, polished to a gleam. The kind of trinket one might place on a mantelpiece as decoration. And every woman in that room over the age of 16 understood exactly what it meant. The spinning wheel. The ancient symbol of the spinster, the unmarried woman, the one left behind. For my darling Genevieve, Araminta announced to the crowd, her voice rich with false tenderness, who has spent her 33 years so devoted to her little books and her little bottles of glue that she has quite forgotten to live the rest of her life. She paused, letting the laughter build. I do hope this reminds her that there is still thread to be spun, if she ever decides to stop collecting dust and start collecting suitors. The room erupted. Some guests had the decency to hide their smiles behind their napkins. Others laughed openly. Lady Pemberton, seated at the family table, shook her head with theatrical pity. Sir Reginald Croft, the groom, studied his wineglass as though the answer to the meaning of life floated somewhere between the Bordeaux and the crystal. Genevieve stood perfectly still. Her fingers did not tremble. Her expression did not crack. Inside her chest, something hot and sharp pressed against her ribs, but she had long ago learned the difference between pain and surrender. Pain was unavoidable. Surrender was a choice. She looked at the spinning wheel. She looked at her younger sister's gleaming, triumphant face. And then Genevieve did something that unsettled Araminta far more than tears ever could. She smiled. How thoughtful, Genevieve said softly, her voice steady and warm. She picked up the little silver wheel with both hands, examined it with genuine curiosity, and turned it over as though inspecting a fine antique. 17th century Flemish design, if I am not mistaken. Sterling silver, hand-cast. Araminta, this is actually quite a remarkable piece. She looked up at her sister with calm, clear eyes. Thank you. And then she curtsied. A full, graceful, perfectly executed curtsy, and walked away from the center of the room, carrying the spinning wheel, tucked neatly under her arm, as though she had just been handed a bouquet of roses. The laughter in the room stumbled. A few guests exchanged glances. The insult had landed, certainly, but the target had refused to bleed. And there is nothing more disorienting to a crowd than watching someone absorb a blow and walk away whole. Araminta's smile flickered for just a moment, before she recovered and raised her glass. "To family," she declared brightly. "To family," the guests echoed. Genevieve did not echo anything. She was already through the side corridor, past the servants' entrance, and halfway down a paneled hallway she had never walked before. Her shoes clicked against the stone floor in a quick, sharp rhythm. Her breath came faster now, because the curtsy and the composure and the clever words had cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. She turned a corner, then another, and found herself standing before a pair of heavy oak doors, slightly ajar. The smell hit her first. Old leather, aged paper, dust, and the faint sweetness of dried lavender sachets tucked between shelves. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a library, a grand, sprawling, thoroughly neglected library. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling across every wall, packed with volumes that clearly had gone untouched for years. Cobwebs laced the upper corners. A fine layer of dust coated the reading table by the window, where a single shaft of golden afternoon light cut across the surface like a blade. And there, sitting abandoned on the edge of that table, half wrapped in a disintegrating linen cloth, was a book. Or rather, what remained of one. Genevieve set the spinning wheel on a chair and moved toward the table as though pulled by an invisible thread. The binding was cracked and separating. 16th century, she could tell at a glance. The vellum leaves were curling at the edges, threatening to detach entirely from the spine. Whoever had left this here had either forgotten it existed or had no idea what they possessed. She reached into her reticule, the small beaded bag she carried everywhere, and pulled out a thin bone folder, a strip of Japanese tissue, and a tiny vial of wheat starch paste. She always carried them, the way a soldier carries a knife or a surgeon carries a scalpel. These were her instruments, and they had never once failed her. Genevieve pulled up a chair, sat down in the golden light, and began to work. And for the first time all day, the tightness in her chest finally released. She did not hear the footsteps behind her. She did not notice the shadow that fell across the doorway several minutes later. She did not see the tall figure who stopped at the threshold, one hand resting on the doorframe, watching in complete silence as this woman, this uninvited ghost from the second table, handled a crumbling manuscript with the precision and tenderness of someone holding the world's last living thing. Duke Henry of Ravenswood stood in the doorway and forgot, entirely, why he had come looking for a quiet room in the first place. He had been watching her for almost 3 full minutes before she noticed him. Duke Henry of Ravenswood was not a man accustomed to being ignored. At 37, he held one of the oldest titles in England, maintained estates across 3 counties, and possessed a library at Ravenswood Abbey that scholars from Oxford and Cambridge begged permission to visit. When he entered a room, people stood. When he spoke, people listened. When he attended a wedding, even one as tedious as this, he was seated at the head table, offered the finest claret, and surrounded by every ambitious mother with an eligible daughter within 40 miles, which was precisely why he had escaped. He had endured Lady Pemberton's 3rd attempt to introduce him to her niece, survived Sir Reginald's cousin, droning endlessly about his new hunting dogs, and finally slipped away during the toast when every head in the room had turned toward the unfortunate woman with the spinning wheel. He had seen that moment. He had watched the younger sister deliver her cruelty wrapped in silk, and he had watched the elder sister absorb it without so much as a cracked syllable. He had noticed, and then he had left, because other people's family wounds were none of his concern, or so he had told himself, until he found her here. Genevieve's hands moved with a kind of fluency that Henry had only ever seen in two places: in the fingers of concert musicians and in the workshops of master craftsmen. She held the bone folder at an angle, so precise it seemed instinctive, pressing the lifting edge of a vellum leaf back toward the spine with patient, measured strokes. Her other hand held a thin strip of translucent tissue, already pasted, waiting for the exact moment the adhesion would hold without moisture damage. She was not fumbling. She was not guessing. She was performing surgery on a dying manuscript with the calm authority of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Henry stepped into the room. The floorboard beneath his boot creaked, and Genevieve's head snapped up. For a brief, unguarded second, her face held the raw expression of someone caught in a private act: embarrassment, surprise, and something close to defiance all tangled together. Then the composure returned, smooth and practiced as a theater curtain falling into place. "Forgive me," she said quickly, already pulling her hands back from the manuscript. "I ought not to have touched it. I saw the binding separating, and the leaves were in danger of—" She stopped herself, as though realizing she was explaining her trade to a stranger who almost certainly did not care. "I apologize. I will leave everything as I found it." "You will do no such thing," Henry said. Genevieve blinked. Henry crossed the room and stood on the opposite side of the reading table. He looked down at the manuscript, then at the instruments she had laid out beside it: the bone folder, the tissue strips, the tiny glass vial of paste, and then back at Genevieve. "That binding has been sitting on this table for at least 2 years, he said. "I noticed it during a previous visit to this estate, and mentioned to our host that it required professional attention. I was assured it would be handled." He glanced around at the dust-laden shelves and the cobwebbed corners. Evidently, their definition of handled differs considerably from mine. Genevieve studied him carefully, the way a person studies someone who has just said something unexpectedly intelligent. "You recognize the condition of the binding? From a casual visit?" There was nothing casual about it. The spine was already cracked 18 months ago. I could see the cords pulling loose through the leather. He paused. "May I?" He gestured toward the manuscript. Genevieve hesitated, then stepped aside slightly to give him a clearer view. Henry leaned closer, examining the vellum leaves she had been stabilizing. His brow furrowed. "You are using a wheat starch paste." "I am. At this humidity, most restorers would use a methyl cellulose adhesive. It bonds faster and requires less drying time." Genevieve tilted her head. "Most restorers would, and they would be wrong. Methyl cellulose is a modern compound, and it responds poorly to aged animal skin parchment. Within 3 to 5 years, it yellows, becomes brittle, and causes secondary cracking along the original repair line. Wheat starch has been used in Japanese conservation for over 4 centuries, precisely because it remains flexible and reversible." She said it the way someone states that water is wet, without arrogance, without showing off, simply as a matter of settled fact. Henry straightened up. He looked at Genevieve Vance as though seeing her for the first time, and in a sense he was. The woman from the dining hall, the quiet figure in the plum dress who had accepted her humiliation with a curtsy, was gone. In her place stood someone entirely different. Someone whose hands held centuries, with the kind of reverence most people reserved for living things. "Where did you train?" he asked. I apprenticed under Mr. Alastair Finch at the Royal Binding Society when I was 17, Genevieve said. After his retirement, I continued independently. I have maintained my own atelier in Covent Garden for the past 6 years. Finch, Henry repeated, his eyebrows rising. Alastair Finch trained only 4 apprentices in his entire career. I have met 2 of them. Neither of them demonstrated anything close to what you have just done to this binding in the last 10 minutes. Genevieve said nothing to that, but a faint warmth crept into her expression, a quiet, almost reluctant glow, like embers stirring beneath ash. Henry pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not ask permission. He did not make small talk. He simply sat, rested his forearms on the edge of the table, and said, "Tell me about the leaves. What century do you estimate?" And Genevieve, who had spent the entire afternoon swallowing polite cruelties and pretending she was made of stone, felt something shift in the air between them. Because this man had not asked her age, had not glanced at her ring finger, had not inquired about her marital prospects or her family connections. He had looked at her work, and he had asked her about the work. She sat down across from him, pulled the manuscript gently back toward the light, and began to talk. The vellum is calfskin, not goatskin. You can tell by the grain pattern and the way it curls under humidity. Based on the ruling lines and the style of rubrication, I would place this somewhere between 1530 and 1560. But the interesting thing is here. She turned the manuscript carefully, revealing the inner margin of the 3rd leaf, where a faint series of handwritten numbers ran vertically along the gutter. These are not page numbers. They are accounting entries. Someone used the margins of a liturgical text to keep financial records, which means this volume may have once served as an estate ledger, likely for this very property. Henry stared at the faded numbers, then looked up at Genevieve. "You determined all of that in the time it took me to walk from the dining hall to this corridor?" Genevieve allowed herself the smallest smile. "The manuscript told me, and I simply listened." The late afternoon sun had shifted, and the golden light that had been resting on the table now fell directly across the 2 of them. This improbable pair, seated across from one another in a forgotten room full of forgotten books, while 200 wedding guests laughed and danced in a world that suddenly felt very far away. Henry leaned forward slightly. "There is something I have been searching for," he said, "for 3 years now, and I believe I may have just found it sitting at the wrong table at my friend's wedding." Genevieve's hands went still over the manuscript. "I beg your pardon?" Henry settled back in his chair and folded his hands together, his expression shifting from admiration to something more deliberate. The look of a man who had been carrying a question for a very long time and had finally caught the scent of an answer. "3 years ago," he began, "a manuscript was brought to auction at Christie's, a folio, early 15th century, known among collectors as the Blackwood Folio. It had belonged to the Blackwood family of Northumberland for over 200 years before financial ruin forced them to sell. By the time it reached the auction house, it was in a deplorable state. The oak boards were split, the brass clasps had corroded into the leather, and nearly a third of the leaves had sustained water damage so severe that the iron gall ink had begun eating through the parchment." Genevieve's face gave nothing away, but her fingers, resting lightly on the edge of the reading table, pressed down just slightly, the kind of involuntary response that only someone watching very closely would catch. Henry was watching very closely. "The folio was purchased by Lord Ashworth," he continued. "A man who, between us, has more money than taste and more ambition than either. Ashworth wanted the folio restored for display at his country estate. Every reputable conservator in London examined it and declared the damage irreversible. The iron gall corrosion alone would have destroyed any remaining text the moment traditional cleaning solvents were applied. It was, By every professional assessment, a lost cause. He paused. The evening light through the library windows had turned from gold to copper, and shadows were beginning to pool in the corners of the room. Somewhere in the distant wing of the manor, a string quartet started playing a waltz for the wedding guests. The faint melody drifted through the walls like a ghost. And then, Henry said quietly, someone restored it. Anonymously. Lord Ashworth received the folio back in a plain wooden crate, wrapped in acid-free linen, with a handwritten note explaining every technique that had been used. The iron gall corrosion had been halted using a calcium phytate treatment, a method so rare that I have only ever read about it in a single Japanese conservation journal published 12 years ago. The water-damaged leaves had been washed, resized, and relined with such precision that the original ink remained entirely legible. The binding had been reconstructed using period-appropriate materials: hand-twisted linen cords, alum-tawed pigskin, and wooden boards cut to match the original oak grain. Genevieve had gone very still. Her eyes remained fixed on the manuscript in front of her, but she was no longer seeing it. Lord Ashworth, being the sort of man he is, immediately tried to take credit for discovering this miraculous restorer. But the artisan had left no name, no address, no means of contact. The invoice had been submitted through a solicitor's office under a trust account. I spent 6 months attempting to trace the payment records and reached a dead end at a holding company, registered in Cheapside. Henry leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something almost intimate, the tone of a man sharing a confession rather than telling a story. I have been looking for the person who restored the Blackwood folio ever since. I have written to conservators across England, Scotland, and the continent. I have visited workshops in Florence, consulted archivists in Vienna, and corresponded with the director of the Imperial Library in St. Petersburg. Every one of them said the same thing. Whoever restored that folio possessed a combination of technical mastery and historical intuition that they had never encountered in a living practitioner. He stopped speaking. The silence between them was so complete that Genevieve could hear the candle on the far shelf guttering in a faint draught. "And now," Henry said, "I am sitting in a forgotten library in Surrey, watching a woman use a wheat starch adhesive with the exact same hand technique that was documented in the Blackwood restoration notes. A woman who trained under Alistair Finch, who operates from a private atelier, and who submits invoices through intermediaries because she prefers her work to speak louder than her name." Genevieve finally looked up. Their eyes met across the reading table, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke. "It was you," Henry said. "Wasn't it?" The waltz from the distant ballroom swelled and faded. A log shifted in the cold hearth, somewhere down the corridor. Genevieve exhaled slowly. A measured, deliberate breath, the kind a person takes when they are deciding how much of themselves to reveal. "Lord Ashworth's solicitor contacted me through a referral from the British Museum's manuscript division," she said, her voice low and steady. "The folio arrived at my workshop in 11 separate parcels, each one packed so poorly that I spent the first 2 days simply stabilizing what the transit had damaged further. The corrosion was advanced, far worse than what Ashworth's initial assessment had described. I nearly refused the commission twice, but you didn't." "I couldn't." Something shifted in her expression, a flicker of the passion she kept so carefully buried beneath her composed exterior. "The Blackwood folio contains one of the only surviving copies of Matthias Brenner's 1421 trade manuscript. Brenner documented the entire Hanseatic League's wool trade routes through the Low Countries, ports, tariffs, merchant guild agreements, records that were believed to have been destroyed in the Hamburg fire of 1432. That folio was a window into an entire century of European commerce that the historical record had simply lost. I could not let it disappear because some lord's cellar had a leaking roof. Henry stared at her. In his experience, people spoke about rare manuscripts the way they spoke about fine paintings, with polished reverence, with collector's pride, with the careful vocabulary of someone who understood value in pounds and prestige. Genevieve spoke about the Blackwood Folio the way a surgeon spoke about a patient on the operating table. The manuscript was not an object to her. It was alive, and it had been dying, and she had refused to let it go. "The calcium phytate treatment," he said. "Where did you learn it?" "I developed my own formulation. The Japanese method described in the Kyoto Journal uses a concentration that works well for mulberry bark paper, but is too aggressive for European vellum. I reduced the solution strength by nearly half and extended the application time to compensate. It took me 11 trial runs on sample parchment before I was satisfied the treatment would hold without altering the surface texture. 11 trial runs. I do not guess with other people's history, Your Grace." The words landed in the room with quiet authority. Henry felt something rearrange itself inside his understanding of the world. A small but unmistakable shift, like a compass needle finding true north after years of spinning. He had spent 3 years searching for this person. He had imagined a gray-bearded scholar working in some cluttered university office, or perhaps a reclusive continental master hidden away in a Florentine workshop. He had imagined someone old, someone decorated, someone surrounded by apprentices and institutional prestige. He had never imagined a woman in a second-hand plum dress, sitting in a dusty library at a wedding she had clearly been invited to as a target, holding a bone folder with hands that could bring the dead back to life. "Why anonymous?" he asked. "The restoration of the Blackwood Folio would have made your reputation overnight. You would have had commissions from every great house in England." Genevieve considered the question carefully. "Because I have seen what reputation does to craft," she said. "The moment a restorer becomes famous, the work changes. Clients stop caring whether you are skilled and start caring whether you are fashionable. They invite you to dinner parties to show you off to their friends. They hang your name beside their manuscripts as though your identity adds value to the parchment." She shook her head slightly. "I restore documents so they can survive another 300 years. That is the work. Everything else is decoration." Henry was quiet for a long time after that. The library had grown dark around them, and the only light left was the last thin ribbon of sunset pressing through the western window. "Miss Vance," he said finally, and his voice carried a weight that made Genevieve's breath catch despite herself. "I have a manuscript at my estate in Ravenswood Abbey, a 14th-century royal charter, one of only 3 surviving copies of Edward II's northern border agreements. It has sustained significant damage over the past decade, and I have yet to find a conservator I trust with its care." He held her gaze with the steady certainty of a man who had just made a decision he would not be talked out of. "I believe I have found her." Genevieve did not sleep well that night. She had been given a small guest room on the 3rd floor of Oakhaven Manor, the kind of room reserved for distant relations and obligatory invitations, with a narrow bed, faded wallpaper, and a window that overlooked the service courtyard rather than the gardens. Araminta's touch, no doubt. Every detail of this weekend had been arranged to remind Genevieve of her place. But for once, the room did not bother her. What kept her awake was the conversation. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word the Duke had spoken in that library. The Blackwood Folio, the 3-year search, the way he had described the calcium phytate treatment with enough technical accuracy to prove he had actually read the Kyoto Journal, a publication so obscure that Genevieve had been forced to obtain her copy through a bookseller in Yokohama who took 4 months to deliver it. He had understood her work, truly understood it. That had never happened before. Clients appreciated her results. Fellow conservators respected her methods. but understanding, the kind that went beyond admiration and into genuine comprehension of why the work mattered. That was something Genevieve had stopped expecting from anyone years ago. She pressed her palms against her eyes and told herself firmly to stop thinking about it. By 6 o'clock the following morning, she was dressed, packed, and carrying her small leather traveling case down the main staircase. The wedding guests would not begin stirring until at least 9. Breakfast would be laid out at 10. The carriages for departure were not scheduled until noon. But Genevieve had no intention of staying for any of it. She had already arranged for a seat on the 7 o'clock stagecoach from the village inn, and if she walked briskly, she could reach it in 20 minutes. She crossed the entrance hall quietly, her boots making soft sounds against the marble. The house was still, that heavy, breathing silence of a country estate in the early hours, when even the servants were only just beginning to stoke the kitchen fires. She was 3 steps from the front door when she heard the voice behind her. "Leaving already?" Genevieve turned. Araminta stood on the landing of the grand staircase, wrapped in a rose-colored dressing gown with her dark hair loose over her shoulders. She looked like she had been awake for some time. Her eyes had that particular sharpness they always carried when she was calculating something. "Good morning, Araminta," Genevieve said evenly. "I have a commission waiting in London, and I cannot afford to delay. Thank you for the invitation. The ceremony was lovely." "Was it?" Araminta descended the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the polished banister. "I barely saw you after the toast. You disappeared for hours. Some of the guests thought you had already left. I found the library." "Of course you did." Araminta reached the bottom step and stopped, keeping herself slightly elevated, a habit she had maintained since childhood, always finding ways to look down. "Books over people. That has always been your way, hasn't it, Genevieve? Even at my own wedding." Genevieve adjusted the handle of her traveling case and said nothing. There was no version of this conversation that ended well, and she had learned long ago that silence was the only language Araminta could not twist. "Well," Araminta said brightly, "I do hope the stagecoach is comfortable. It is a long ride back to London in a public coach. Perhaps you could mend a few books along the way to pass the time." She laughed at her own joke, a light, musical laugh that sounded almost genuine if you did not know her. Genevieve offered a polite nod, turned, and walked out the front door into the gray Surrey morning. She did not look back. She never looked back. The gravel drive crunched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the estate gate. Mist hung low over the lawns, and the old oak trees that lined the approach road stood like dark sentinels in the early light. A pair of stable boys were already moving about near the carriage house, preparing the horses for the day's departures. Genevieve walked with purpose, her traveling case in one hand and her reticule in the other. The spinning wheel, Araminta's charming little gift, she had left on the nightstand in her guest room. Let the maids find it. Let them wonder. By 6:30, she had reached the village inn, purchased her ticket, and settled onto the wooden bench of the stagecoach, beside a wool merchant's wife and a clergyman reading a psalter. By 7 o'clock, the coach lurched forward, and Surrey began to fall away behind her. She told herself the tightness in her chest was simply the cold morning air. Back at Oakhaven Manor, Duke Henry of Ravenswood came downstairs at 8:30. He had dressed with more care than usual, a detail he chose not to examine too closely, and made his way directly to the breakfast room, where the early risers among the wedding party were already gathered around the sideboard. He scanned the room once, then again. He accepted a cup of coffee from a footman and positioned himself near the tall windows overlooking the front portico, where the first departure carriages were being brought round. By 9 o'clock, he had spoken with the retired colonel, the vicar's mother, and 2 of Sir Reginald's university friends. None of them had seen Miss Vance that morning. By 9:30, he abandoned subtlety entirely and approached the entrance hall, where the estate's head butler was coordinating the luggage arrangements. "Excuse me," Henry said. "I am looking for Miss Genevieve Vance. I believe she was a guest in the East Wing." The butler consulted his ledger briefly. "Miss Vance departed at approximately 6 o'clock this morning, Your Grace. She arranged her own transportation from the village inn." Henry stood very still for a moment. "She has already gone." "I am afraid so, Your Grace." "Did she leave any message? A forwarding address, perhaps?" "She did not, Your Grace." Henry stared at the open front door, through which the morning light was now streaming in earnest, and felt something remarkably close to frustration, which was unusual, because Duke Henry of Ravenswood was a patient man by nature and by training. He thanked the butler and turned toward the corridor. He was halfway to the drawing room when a new voice intercepted him. "Your Grace, what a pleasant surprise to find you still here." Araminta swept toward him in a morning dress of pale blue muslin, her hair now pinned in an elaborate arrangement that must have required at least 30 minutes, and a dedicated lady's maid. Her smile was wide and warm and entirely manufactured. "Lady Croft," Henry said, with the precise degree of politeness that courtesy demanded, and not 1 degree more. "I was hoping to speak with your sister before my departure." "Genevieve?" Araminta widened her eyes, as though the name itself was a mild surprise. "Oh, I am afraid she left hours ago. She insisted on taking the public stagecoach. You know how she is, always so stubbornly independent. She barely said goodbye. I think she was embarrassed, poor thing." "Embarrassed?" Henry repeated. "Well, you know." Araminta lowered her voice to a confidential murmur. "She does find these social occasions rather overwhelming. She is much more comfortable in her little workshop, surrounded by her old papers and paste pots. It is her world, and I think we must respect that, even if it seems rather lonely from the outside." She delivered every word with the precise tone of a loving younger sister, expressing gentle concern. It was a masterful performance. Henry recognized it immediately, because he had spent 20 years navigating London society, and could identify a lie, dressed in silk from across a crowded ballroom. "Indeed," he said simply. "Thank you, Lady Croft." He walked past her without another word, leaving Araminta standing in the corridor with her manufactured smile slowly thinning. 20 minutes later, Duke Henry sat in his private carriage as it rolled through the gates of Oakhaven Manor. His valet, seated across from him, was arranging travel blankets and sorting correspondence. Henry ignored all of it. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small folded paper. On it, written in his own hand earlier that morning after a brief and productive conversation with the estate's housekeeper, was a London address. Miss G. Vance, Atelier of Manuscript Conservation, Number 14, Hart Street, Covent Garden. Henry tucked the paper back into his pocket, leaned against the cushioned seat, and watched the Surrey countryside pass by. He could be patient. He had waited 3 years already. A few more days would make no difference. 4 days passed before the Duke's carriage appeared on Hart Street. Genevieve had spent those 4 days the way she spent most of her days, quietly, productively, and alone. Her atelier occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian townhouse, wedged between a printmaker's shop and a tea merchant. The frontage was modest, a single bow window with her name painted in small gold letters on the glass, so understated that most passers-by walked straight past without noticing. Inside was a different world entirely. The workshop was a single long room, with high ceilings and tall windows along the northern wall, positioned to catch the most even, consistent light London could offer. A heavy oak work table dominated the center, its surface scarred and stained from years of use, but kept immaculately clean. Along the walls stood wooden cabinets filled with the tools of her trade, bone folders of varying widths, Japanese tissue in 6 different weights, hand-ground pigments in glass jars, rolls of gold leaf thinner than breath, and dozens of small bottles containing adhesives, solvents, and consolidants she had formulated herself. A drying rack near the back wall held 3 partially restored estate maps from a country house in Devonshire, her current commission. On a smaller side table, a magnifying glass on a brass stand was positioned over a fragment of medieval psalter she had been examining for signs of iron gall corrosion. This room was Genevieve's kingdom. Here she answered to no one. Here no one mocked her age or her solitude or the calluses on her fingertips. Here every object had a purpose, every surface had a function, and the only voice that mattered was the one rising from the parchment beneath her hands. She was seated at the work table on the morning of the 5th day, carefully humidifying a brittle section of the Devonshire maps with a damp blotting cloth, when she heard the sound of horses outside her window, heavy horses, by the rhythm of the hooves. More than 2. Genevieve glanced up. Through the bow window she saw a carriage, large, lacquered in deep black with silver fittings, drawn by a matched pair of grey geldings, pulling to a stop directly in front of her shop. The coachman wore formal livery. A footman, in a powdered wig, stepped down from the rear platform and opened the carriage door with practiced efficiency. Duke Henry of Ravenswood stepped onto Hart Street, looked up at the gold lettering on her window, and adjusted his gloves. Genevieve set down the blotting cloth and sat very still for approximately 5 seconds. Then she stood, smoothed her work apron, and walked to the front door. She opened it, just as Henry raised his hand to knock. They looked at each other across the threshold. The morning noise of Covent Garden filled the gap between them, the rattle of carts on cobblestones, the calls of flower sellers from the nearby market, the distant chime of a church bell striking 11. "Your Grace," Genevieve said. "Miss Vance," Henry replied. "I hope I am not interrupting your work." "You are, in fact." The corner of Henry's mouth moved slightly, the ghost of a smile that he caught and contained before it fully formed. "Then I shall endeavor to make the interruption worth your time. May I come in?" Genevieve stepped aside and held the door open. Henry entered the atelier and stopped 3 paces inside, his eyes moving slowly across the room. The cabinets, the drying rack, the magnifying stand, the rows of carefully labeled bottles. He studied the space the way Genevieve studied manuscripts, methodically, respectfully, missing nothing. "You keep a cold workshop," he observed. The room was cool and dry, with no fire burning in the small hearth near the back wall. "Heat and humidity are the 2 greatest enemies of aged parchment," Genevieve said, closing the door behind him. "I keep the temperature low and the air as dry as London will permit, which is an ongoing battle in itself." "And you work alone?" "I had an assistant for 2 years, a young woman from the Foundling Hospital whom I trained in basic paper repair. She married a clerk in Holborn last spring and left my employment." Genevieve paused. "I have not yet found a suitable replacement. The work requires a particular temperament. Patience. More than patience. Patience suggests merely waiting. Conservation requires a willingness to spend 4 hours on a single square inch of damaged surface and find genuine satisfaction in the result, even when no one else in the world will ever notice what you did." Henry turned to look at her. She was standing by the work table, with her arms folded loosely across her apron, her expression composed and professional, but her eyes were alert, watchful, in the way of someone who was accustomed to measuring people's intentions before lowering her guard. He understood that. He had spent his entire adult life doing precisely the same thing. "I mentioned a manuscript to you at Oakhaven," he said. "The Royal Charter, Edward II's Northern Border Agreements. You remember the details." "I remember everything about manuscripts, Your Grace. It is the one area where my memory has never disappointed me. Henry reached inside his coat and produced a leather document case, long and flat, fastened with brass buckles. He set it on the work table with care, unfastened the buckles, and opened the case. Inside, cushioned in a bed of unbleached cotton, lay a single folded sheet of parchment, roughly 18 inches wide. Even from where she stood, Genevieve could see the age of it, the way the surface had darkened to a deep amber, the faint tide lines where moisture had crept across the membrane decades ago, the hairline fractures running along the fold lines where the parchment had been opened and closed too many times over too many centuries. She stepped forward without thinking. Her hands came up instinctively, hovering just above the surface, close enough to feel the texture of the air around the document without touching it. "May I?" she asked quietly. "Please." Genevieve reached for a pair of thin cotton gloves from a drawer beneath the work table and pulled them on. Then, with a slowness that bordered on reverence, she lifted the edge of the parchment and unfolded it across the table. The charter spread open like a map of another age. Dense lines of Latin text filled the upper two-thirds of the document, written in a formal chancery hand with elaborate, decorated initials. At the bottom, 3 pendant wax seals hung from braided silk cords, 2 of them cracked, one nearly severed from its attachment point. A large water stain covered the lower left quadrant, obscuring several lines of text beneath a pale brown tide mark. Genevieve leaned over the document, her face inches from the surface. She moved along its length with the focused intensity of a physician examining a patient, pausing at each point of damage, each crack, each discoloration. "The seals are 14th century, she murmured, almost to herself. "The green wax is consistent with royal chancery practice under Edward II. The silk cords are original. You can see the hand-twist pattern, but this one here is hanging by fewer than a dozen fibers. If it breaks, the seal is lost." She straightened up and looked at Henry with an expression he had not seen before, a fierce, protective focus that transformed her entire face. "How long has the charter been stored in this condition?" "At least a decade, possibly longer. My father kept it in a chest in the lower library at Ravenswood Abbey, which sustained a roof leak in 1839. By the time the damage was discovered, the water stain had already set." Genevieve pressed her lips together. "A decade of untreated moisture damage on 14th century parchment. Your Grace, this document should have been stabilized years ago." "I know," Henry said simply. "That is why I am here." Their eyes met across the charter, this fragile 600-year-old record of borders and agreements and a kingdom's promises. And something passed between them that had nothing to do with parchment and everything to do with trust. "I will take the commission," Genevieve said. "On one condition." Henry raised an eyebrow. "People did not typically set conditions with a duke. No one rushes me. This document will be ready when it is ready, and I will not compress my process to accommodate a dinner party or an exhibition schedule. The charter has waited 600 years. It can wait a few weeks more." Henry extended his hand. Genevieve looked at it for a moment, then removed her cotton glove and shook it. Her grip was firm and dry and certain, and Henry held it perhaps a fraction of a second longer than professional courtesy required. "Take all the time you need, Miss Vance," he said. "I have learned recently that the most valuable things tend to reveal themselves on their own schedule." Araminta Croft learned about the Duke's visit to Hart Street the way she learned most things that mattered, through gossip delivered over afternoon tea. She had been back in London for 3 days, returned early from what was supposed to be a fortnight-long honeymoon tour of Bath and the Cotswolds. Sir Reginald had business obligations he could not postpone, he said, though Araminta suspected the truth was simpler. They had already exhausted their supply of things to say to each other, and the silence in a hired Bath townhouse was considerably less comfortable than silence in their own Mayfair residence, where at least the rooms were large enough to avoid one another. It was Lady Pemberton who mentioned it. They were seated in Lady Pemberton's drawing room on Grosvenor Square, nibbling at almond biscuits and dissecting the previous evening's opera, when Lady Pemberton said, quite casually, "I understand the Duke of Ravenswood has engaged a conservator for his family's charter collection. Someone mentioned he visited an atelier in Covent Garden last week. A woman, apparently. Most unusual." Araminta's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "A woman conservator," Lady Pemberton continued, reaching for another biscuit. "In Covent Garden, of all places. I cannot imagine what sort of establishment that must be. Though I suppose the Duke has always had rather eccentric tastes when it comes to his library." "Did they mention her name?" Araminta asked, keeping her voice light. "I believe it was Vance." "Yes, that was it. Vance." Lady Pemberton glanced up. "Oh, is that not your maiden name, dear? How amusing. Perhaps you are related." Araminta smiled. It was the kind of smile that cost her every ounce of control she possessed. "My elder sister," she said sweetly. "She does tinker with old papers from time to time. How charming that the Duke has taken an interest." She stayed for precisely 12 more minutes, finished her tea, complimented Lady Pemberton's new curtains, and left. By the time her carriage reached Mayfair, the smile was gone. Genevieve. Of course it was Genevieve. The woman could not even attend a wedding without somehow attracting the attention of the most eligible man in the room. It was infuriating. It defied every natural law of society. Genevieve was 33, unmarried, professionally employed, and lived above a shop in Covent Garden. She owned 4 good dresses. She smelled of wheat paste and old leather. She had the social ambitions of a library catalogue. And yet a duke, had sought her out. Araminta sat in her drawing room for the remainder of the afternoon, staring at the wallpaper and thinking. By evening she had a plan. By the following morning she had refined it. And by 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 8th day since the wedding, she was standing on Hart Street, rapping her gloved knuckles against the door of her sister's atelier. Genevieve opened the door, and, for one unguarded instant, her expression revealed genuine surprise. Then the familiar caution settled over her features, like a curtain being drawn. "Araminta. Genevieve, darling." Araminta stepped forward and clasped both of Genevieve's hands before she could pull away. "I have been meaning to visit for simply ages. I felt dreadful about the wedding, truly dreadful. The spinning wheel was meant as a jest, but I realized afterward how it must have seemed, and I could not live with myself without coming to apologize in person." Genevieve studied her sister's face. Every instinct she possessed, every finely tuned sense that could detect a forgery at 20 paces, told her that this apology was counterfeit. The ink was wrong. The paper was wrong. The whole composition was wrong. But Araminta was still her sister. And Genevieve, despite everything, had never entirely abandoned the hope that somewhere beneath the performances and the cruelty, the girl she had once read bedtime stories to still existed. "Come in," Genevieve said. Araminta entered the workshop and looked around with the expression of someone touring a particularly quaint ruin. "How cozy," she murmured, running a gloved finger along the edge of a cabinet. "You have done so much with such a small space." "It serves my purposes. I am sure it does." Araminta's eyes swept the room. The drying rack, the tool cabinets, the magnifying stand, and came to rest on the work table in the center. There, spread open beneath a protective sheet of acid-free tissue, lay the royal charter. Araminta moved closer. "Is this what the Duke brought you?" Lady Pemberton mentioned something about a commission. Genevieve felt a small pulse of alarm. She had not told anyone about the charter. The fact that Araminta already knew about it, knew enough to come here, knew enough to ask about it so casually, meant that information was circulating in drawing rooms where it had no business being discussed. "It is a private commission," Genevieve said carefully. "I am not at liberty to discuss the details." "Oh, how very mysterious." Araminta laughed and settled herself into the only comfortable chair in the workshop, a worn leather armchair near the window that Genevieve used during long examination sessions. "I am not here to interrogate you, Genevieve. I am here because I miss my sister." The words hung in the air with the delicate weight of a soap bubble. Beautiful, hollow, and certain to burst. "Would you like some tea?" Genevieve asked, because hospitality was a reflex she could not override, even when every nerve in her body was telling her to escort Araminta back to the street. "That would be lovely. Thank you." Genevieve hesitated. The tea things were in the small back kitchen, a converted scullery separated from the workshop by a narrow corridor and a closed door. Preparing tea would take her out of the room for several minutes. She glanced at the charter on the work table. She glanced at Araminta, who was examining her fingernails with an air of perfect boredom. "I will only be a moment," Genevieve said. She walked down the corridor, filled the kettle from the hand pump, and set it on the small spirit stove. While the water heated, she arranged 2 cups on a tray and measured out the leaves. In the workshop, Araminta was already on her feet. She moved quickly and silently to the work table. Her eyes found what she was looking for almost immediately, a glass ink flask sitting on a small tray beside Genevieve's writing instruments. It was half full of carbon black ink, the kind used for annotation and labeling. Araminta lifted the tissue covering the charter. The parchment lay beneath it, ancient and fragile, its Latin text and pendant seals exposed to the cool workshop air. 600 years of history, spread across 18 inches of calfskin membrane. She picked up the ink flask. Her hand did not tremble. There was no moment of hesitation, no flicker of conscience, no internal voice asking her whether this was something a reasonable person would do. Araminta had moved beyond reason, somewhere around the moment Lady Pemberton said the word Vance in her drawing room, and she had not looked back since. She tipped the flask. The ink spread across the lower left section of the charter in a slow, dark bloom, seeping into the parchment fibers, pooling in the hairline cracks, swallowing the faded Latin text beneath an opaque black tide. It reached the nearest wax seal and crept along the braided silk cord like a vine climbing a trellis. Araminta set the flask back on the tray, replaced the tissue sheet over the charter, and returned to the leather armchair. She crossed her ankles, folded her hands in her lap, and arranged her face into an expression of mild contentment. When Genevieve returned 3 minutes later carrying a tea tray, Araminta accepted her cup with a grateful smile, sipped it twice, and declared that she really must be going. Sir Reginald expected her for dinner, and she still needed to stop at the milliner on Bond Street. She kissed Genevieve on the cheek at the door, promised to visit again soon, and climbed into her waiting carriage without once looking back at the workshop window. Genevieve stood in the doorway, watching the carriage pull away. Something felt wrong. The air in the room behind her felt disturbed, rearranged in some subtle way she could sense, but could not yet name. She turned back to the work table. She lifted the tissue sheet, and for the first time in her adult life, Genevieve Vance felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The ink was still wet. That was the first thing Genevieve's mind registered, and it registered it the way a clockmaker registers the position of a gear. Instantly, precisely, and with immediate calculation of every consequence that would follow. Fresh carbon black ink on 600-year-old parchment. If it dried fully into the membrane, the pigment would bond with the collagen fibers permanently. The text beneath would be lost. The Restoration Commission would be destroyed, and her reputation, the quiet, hard-earned, anonymously built reputation that was the foundation of everything she had, would be finished. She had perhaps 2 hours before the ink set beyond recovery, perhaps less, given the low humidity she maintained in the workshop. Genevieve closed her eyes. She pressed both palms flat against the edge of the work table and breathed once, twice, 3 times, until the roaring in her ears subsided and her hands stopped shaking. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Grief could come later. Rage could come later. Right now there was only the work. She opened her eyes and moved. The first thing she did was light every lamp in the workshop. She needed full, even illumination across the entire surface of the charter. The tall windows provided good northern light during the day, but the afternoon was fading, and she could not rely on the sun for what lay ahead. The second thing she did was examine the damage. She pulled her magnifying glass on its brass stand directly over the affected area and studied the ink spread with clinical focus. The carbon black had pooled most heavily across the lower left quadrant, the same area already weakened by the old water stain. The ink had followed the existing tide lines, seeping into the channels where the parchment fibers had been loosened by the original moisture damage a decade ago. It had reached the base of the nearest pendant seal and saturated approximately 4 inches of the braided silk cord. The third thing she did was smell the ink. She leaned close to the surface and inhaled carefully. Carbon black, gum Arabic binder, water base, standard composition. The same ink she kept on her tray for labeling and notation. It was her own ink. Whoever had done this had used her own materials against her. And then she noticed something else, a scent beneath the ink, faint but distinct, lingering on the tissue sheet that had been lifted and replaced over the charter. Amber, rose otto, bergamot, a perfume blend so specific and so expensive that Genevieve recognized it immediately because she had smelled it on her sister's skin for the past 11 years. Ever since Araminta had begun ordering it from a parfumier on German Street at a cost that would have covered Genevieve's workshop rent for 3 months. Genevieve straightened up. She set the tissue sheet aside, handling it by the corners to preserve the scent residue, and placed it in a clean linen envelope which she sealed and labeled with the date and time. Then she turned back to the charter and began to work. The principle was straightforward. Carbon black ink is a suspension of soot particles in a gum Arabic solution. When fresh, the particles sit on the surface of the parchment in a liquid medium. As the water evaporates, the gum Arabic binds the particles to the fibers. If the binding process could be interrupted before completion, if the gum Arabic could be dissolved and the carbon particles lifted while they were still mobile, then the underlying parchment could theoretically be saved. The practice was something else entirely. Genevieve had never attempted a full ink removal on parchment this old. The membrane was already fragile from 6 centuries of aging, compounded by the untreated water damage from the leaking roof. Any solvent strong enough to dissolve the fresh gum Arabic risked reactivating the old water stain and causing further deterioration to the already weakened fibers. She needed something that would target the new ink without disturbing the ancient surface beneath it. She went to her cabinet and began pulling bottles. Distilled water, calcium hydroxide, ethanol, a small jar of phytic acid she had synthesized from rice bran 6 months ago for the Blackwood Folio project. She set them on the side table and stared at them the way a chess player stares at a board, calculating sequences 12 moves ahead. Then she reached for her notebook and began writing formulas. The iron gall neutralizing agent she had developed for the Blackwood Folio would not work here. That treatment was designed for iron-based inks, and this was carbon. She needed a different approach, a gentle alkaline wash to soften the gum Arabic binder, followed by careful mechanical lifting of the carbon particles, using damp cotton swabs under magnification, followed by a controlled rinse with a calcium hydroxide buffer to stabilize the parchment's pH without reactivating the old water stain. It would take hours. It would require absolute precision. 1 degree of excess moisture, 1 moment of impatience, 1 swab pressed too firmly against the fragile surface, and the charter would be lost forever. Genevieve pulled her stool to the work table, positioned her magnifying glass, mixed her first solution, and picked up a cotton swab. She did not stop for 9 hours. Through the evening and deep into the night, she worked in a circle of lamplight, bent over the charter with the focus of a woman performing the most important task of her life. Each swab lifted a tiny quantity of carbon from the surface, a few square millimeters at a time. She changed swabs constantly, discarding each one the moment it became saturated, reaching for a fresh one without looking away from the parchment. Her alkaline solution she applied with a fine sable brush, drop by single drop, watching through the magnifying glass as the gum arabic softened and released its grip on the ancient membrane beneath. By midnight, she had cleared the area around the pendant seal and saved the braided silk cord. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the central pool of ink had been reduced to a pale gray shadow that she knew would fade further with careful treatment over the coming days. By 4 o'clock, as the first thin light of dawn began pressing against the workshop windows, she set down her last swab and leaned back on her stool. The charter lay before her. The Latin text in the lower left quadrant, the lines that had been swallowed by the ink, was visible again. Faded, certainly, slightly more worn than the surrounding text, but legible, present, saved. Genevieve sat motionless for a long time, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders aching, her eyes burning from hours of close work under lamplight. The workshop was silent, except for the ticking of the small clock on the mantelpiece and the first tentative sounds of Covent Garden stirring outside the window. A milk cart rattling over cobblestones, a baker's boy calling to his fellow down the street. She had done it. At 9:30 that morning, the Duke's carriage appeared on Hart Street for the second time. Henry had arranged to visit for a progress report on the charter, a meeting they had scheduled during his first visit, and one he had been looking forward to with an anticipation he found increasingly difficult to attribute to professional interest alone. He knocked twice. The door opened. Genevieve stood before him in the same work dress she had been wearing the previous afternoon, her hair coming loose from its pins, her apron faintly stained with alkaline solution, and the deepest shadows beneath her eyes that Henry had ever seen on a living person. "Miss Vance," he said, his expression shifting immediately to concern. "Are you unwell?" "Come inside," Genevieve said. "There is something you need to see." She walked him through every step: the discovery, the ink identification, the tissue sheet with its telltale perfume residue, sealed in its linen envelope, the 9-hour restoration process, documented in her notebook with timestamps and solution formulas for every stage. And finally the charter itself, saved, stabilized, and resting under a fresh protective cover on the work table. Henry examined it all in silence. He read her notebook entries. He held the linen envelope to his face and recognized the perfume. He had stood close enough to Araminta at the wedding to identify it instantly. He studied the charter under the magnifying glass and traced the faint ghost of the ink stain with his eyes, seeing both the damage that had been done and the extraordinary skill that had undone it. When he finally looked up at Genevieve, his expression held something she had never seen directed at her before, from anyone. "Miss Vance," he said quietly, "I came here this morning to discuss the progress of a commission. Instead, I find that you have spent the entire night saving a document that someone in your own family attempted to destroy, and you have done it so thoroughly that the evidence of the crime is preserved while the damage itself has been erased." He set down the magnifying glass and straightened to his full height. "I would like to invite you to Ravenswood Abbey," he said, "to inspect the full library, and I should tell you plainly that this invitation has very little to do with manuscripts." The carriage ride from London to Oxfordshire took the better part of a day. Genevieve had spent the 3 days between Henry's invitation and the journey itself in a state of quiet preparation that anyone watching might have mistaken for calm. She packed her traveling case with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. Her restoration tools wrapped in soft chamois leather, a fresh notebook with blank pages, 2 pencils sharpened to fine points, and a single change of clothes suitable for an estate visit. She owned nothing elaborate enough for a ducal country house, and she refused to pretend otherwise. She had debated declining the invitation. Twice she had sat down at her writing desk to compose a polite refusal, and twice she had set the pen down without writing a word. The professional justification was sound. Ravenswood Abbey's library was one of the most significant private collections in England, and the opportunity to examine it was the kind of commission that came once in a career. Any conservator in the country would have accepted without hesitation. But Genevieve was not a woman who lied to herself, and she knew perfectly well that the library was not the reason her hand had trembled slightly when she read Henry's letter confirming the arrangements. The carriage arrived at Ravenswood Abbey in the late afternoon, when the Oxfordshire light was doing what it did best, turning every stone surface to warm honey and every shadow to deep lavender. The estate revealed itself gradually as the carriage rolled up the long approach road. First the gatehouse, built in pale limestone with climbing roses spilling over its arched entrance. Then the park, a sweep of ancient oaks and managed meadowland that stretched in every direction. And finally, the abbey itself. Genevieve leaned forward in the carriage and looked through the window. Ravenswood Abbey was not a house that announced itself with grandeur. There were no towering columns, no ostentatious facades, no gold leaf or marble balustrades. It was a medieval foundation that had been adapted over centuries, a long, low structure of weathered Cotswold stone with mullioned windows, a cloistered courtyard visible through an archway, and a chapel tower rising modestly above the western wing. Ivy covered the eastern wall in a thick green curtain that had clearly been growing undisturbed for decades. The overall impression was one of deep, settled permanence, a building that had watched the centuries pass and found them largely unremarkable. Henry was waiting at the front entrance. He wore no formal coat, just a simple waistcoat over shirt sleeves with his cuffs turned back, the dress of a man at home on his own land. He stepped forward as the carriage stopped and opened the door himself before the footman could reach it. "Miss Vance, welcome to Ravenswood." Genevieve took his offered hand and stepped down onto the gravel. The air smelled different here, clean, green, layered with cut grass and the distant sweetness of a walled garden somewhere out of sight. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Henry," he said, "while you are here, I would greatly prefer Henry." Genevieve looked at him for a moment. Titles were boundaries, and she understood boundaries very well. Removing one was an act of deliberate intimacy in a world where formality served as armor. "Henry, then," she said, "and I am Genevieve." He smiled, a full, genuine smile that reshaped his entire face and made him look 5 years younger. "Genevieve, come inside. I want to show you something before the light changes." He led her through the entrance hall, past a staircase of dark oak and a corridor lined with portraits she would have liked to stop and examine, through a set of double doors at the end of the east wing, and into the library. Genevieve stopped walking. The room was vast. 2 full stories of shelving rose from floor to gallery, connected by a narrow iron balcony that ran the entire perimeter. The shelves were oak, darkened with age to nearly black, and every inch of them was filled. Thousands of volumes, leather-bound, cloth-bound, vellum-covered, stood shoulder to shoulder in rows so deep that some shelves held books 2 layers thick. A rolling ladder on brass rails leaned against the northern wall. 3 tall arched windows admitted the late afternoon light, casting long golden rectangles across a Persian carpet so faded that its original pattern was more suggestion than design. At the far end of the room, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in dominated the wall. Above it hung a single painting, a landscape of the estate grounds in autumn, muted and atmospheric, signed in a corner too distant for Genevieve to read. But it was the smell that held her. Old paper, aged leather, beeswax polish, and beneath it all, the unmistakable deep earth scent of parchment. Hundreds of years of accumulated knowledge breathing quietly in the stillness. The collection was begun by my great-great-grandfather in 1743, Henry said, standing beside her. He purchased the core library from a dissolved Benedictine priory and spent the remaining 40 years of his life expanding it. My grandfather added the medieval manuscripts. My father added the maps and estate records, though he was rather less careful about storage conditions, as you have already discovered. Genevieve walked forward slowly, her eyes moving across the shelves with the reverent attention of a pilgrim entering a cathedral. She reached out and touched the spine of a thick folio on the nearest shelf, gently, with just her fingertips, reading its age and condition through the leather, the way a physician reads a pulse. "You have uncatalogued material here," she said quietly. "A great deal of it. My grandfather kept records of his acquisitions, but they are incomplete. My father kept none at all. I have been attempting to compile a proper catalogue for the past 4 years, but I lack the expertise to assess the condition and provenance of the older items." "How many manuscripts, roughly?" "I would estimate between 300 and 400, spanning the 12th to the 17th century. The majority have never been examined by a professional conservator." Genevieve turned to face him. Her expression had changed. The polite composure of a guest had given way to something raw and unguarded. The look of a woman standing before the single thing in the world she was born to do. "Show me everything," she said. They spent the next 2 days together in the library. Henry had cleared his schedule entirely. No visitors, no correspondence, no estate business, and dedicated himself to assisting Genevieve as she moved systematically through the collection. They began with the earliest materials, a set of 12th century monastic charters stored in a cedar chest beneath the gallery stairs, and worked forward through the centuries. Genevieve examined each item with her magnifying glass, dictated condition notes to Henry, who wrote them down in neat columns in a fresh ledger, and flagged the volumes requiring immediate intervention with small strips of red cloth tucked between the pages. They ate meals together at a small table brought into the library so they would not have to interrupt their work. Lunch was cold meats, bread, and cheese. Dinner was simple: roast fowl, vegetables from the estate kitchen garden, and a bottle of claret that Henry poured while Genevieve explained the difference between Mediterranean and Northern European tanning methods in 15th century leather production. They talked constantly. About the manuscripts, at first, the provenance of a particular binding, the significance of a marginal annotation, the history encoded in a scribe's handwriting. But gradually, as the hours passed and the formality between them dissolved like old adhesive in warm water, they talked about other things. Henry told her about inheriting the estate at 24 after his father's sudden death, and the years of solitary effort it had taken to restore the Abbey's finances, while every drawing room in London speculated about when he would marry. Genevieve told him about building her atelier from a single room and a borrowed set of tools, and the particular loneliness of being excellent at something the world considered insignificant. On the second evening, they were seated in the library's window alcove, watching the sun set over the Oxfordshire hills. The sky had turned deep rose and amber, and the light caught the edges of the books on the nearest shelf, gilding their spines in warm color. "May I ask you something?" Henry said. "You may. The spinning wheel. At the wedding. Does she do that sort of thing often?" Genevieve was quiet for a moment. Araminta has been performing for an audience since she was old enough to understand that an audience existed. She is brilliant at it. She always has been. "That is not what I asked." Genevieve looked at him. His face was steady, open, patient. The face of a man who asked questions because he wanted the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. "Yes," she said simply. "She does." Henry nodded slowly. He did not offer sympathy. He did not condemn Araminta or make promises about justice. He simply reached across the space between them and rested his hand over hers on the windowsill. Genevieve did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time, watching the last of the daylight fade over Ravenswood, while 300 years of silent books kept watch around them. The invitation arrived at the Croft residence on a Tuesday morning, carried by a liveried footman wearing the Ravenswood crest on his shoulder, a detail that did not escape the notice of every neighbor on the street, whose curtains happened to twitch as the man passed. Sir Reginald examined the card over breakfast. Heavy cream stock, engraved in copper plate, sealed with dark green wax bearing the Ravenswood ducal arms. An invitation to an exclusive literary soirée at Ravenswood House in Mayfair, hosted by His Grace the Duke of Ravenswood, for the evening of the 18th. "Literary soirée," Sir Reginald muttered, turning the card over as though hoping to find something more interesting on the back. "That sounds like an evening of old men arguing about dead languages." Araminta took the card from his hand and read it twice. Her pulse quickened, though her expression remained perfectly still. She had been waiting for something like this. Some thread, some opening, some opportunity to see exactly what was happening between her sister and the Duke. The whispers had been growing louder over the past week. Lady Pemberton had heard from Mrs. Alcott, who had heard from the Countess of Wexford, that the Duke of Ravenswood had been seen in the company of an unmarried professional woman, a restorer of some kind, at his country estate in Oxfordshire, unchaperoned, for 2 full days. The scandal was still below the surface, circulating through the quieter channels of drawing-room conversation, where reputations were shaped before they were announced. But Araminta knew how these things worked. Given time, the whispers would either become an engagement or a disgrace. Either outcome was unacceptable. "We are attending," Araminta said, setting the card beside her teacup with the careful precision of a general placing a pin on a battlefield map. Sir Reginald looked up from his kipper. "Must we? We must. I do not care for literary evenings, Araminta. The last one we attended, I was trapped for 40 minutes by a man who wanted to discuss the correct translation of a Latin participle." "You will survive another 40 minutes, Reginald." Araminta's voice carried the particular sweetness that her husband had already learned to recognize as the end of a negotiation, rather than the beginning of one. "This is the Duke of Ravenswood. An invitation to his private residence is the sort of thing people wait years for. We are going." Sir Reginald returned his attention to his kipper and said nothing further. He had been married for less than 3 weeks and had already developed an instinct for recognizing the battles that were not worth fighting. Araminta spent the following days preparing with the focus and discipline of a military campaign. She commissioned a new gown from her dressmaker on Bond Street. Ivory silk with French lace at the sleeves, cut to emphasize her figure and her youth in equal measure. She rehearsed conversations about literature and history, drawing from a hastily borrowed volume of essays that she skimmed without absorbing. And she constructed, in careful detail, her expectations for the evening. Genevieve would be there, certainly. The Duke was clearly infatuated with her work, and men of his station often confused intellectual curiosity with romantic interest. But a soirée at a Mayfair townhouse was a different arena entirely from a dusty Oxfordshire library. This was society. This was Araminta's territory. Among the glittering guests and polished conversation of London's elite, Genevieve would be exposed for what she was, a working woman in a borrowed dress, out of her depth, fumbling through small talk, while the real ladies of the room exchanged knowing glances behind their fans. Araminta fully expected to arrive and find Genevieve tucked away in a corner somewhere, perhaps helping to arrange the book displays or assisting the Duke's staff with the exhibit tables, a useful presence, a tolerated one, the kind of woman who was invited out of obligation and seated near the service door. The evening of the 18th arrived mild and clear. Ravenswood House occupied a prominent position on the southern side of Berkeley Square, a handsome 5-bay Georgian townhouse with tall windows that blazed with candlelight as the guests began arriving shortly after 8 o'clock. Carriages queued along the square, depositing lords and ladies, scholars and collectors, publishers and patrons onto the front steps, where liveried footmen guided them through the entrance hall and into the grand reception rooms beyond. Araminta and Sir Reginald arrived at 8:30. Araminta paused on the front steps to adjust her gloves and survey the scene. The quality of the carriages, the caliber of the guests, the sheer weight of social prestige concentrated in a single address. This was where she belonged. This was the world she had married into and intended to master. They entered the reception hall and were announced by the butler. A few heads turned. Sir Reginald was recognized by one or two acquaintances and steered toward them with visible relief. Araminta accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioned herself near the entrance to the main ballroom, where she had a clear line of sight to the room and everyone in it. She scanned the crowd methodically. Scholars in dark coats clustered around display cases containing illuminated manuscripts. Society women drifted between conversation groups, their jewelry catching the candlelight. A string quartet played softly from an alcove near the tall windows. The atmosphere was refined and intimate, more salon than ball, more intellectual than social, which meant the guest list had been curated with care. Genevieve was nowhere to be seen. Araminta felt a small pulse of satisfaction. Perhaps she had overestimated the situation. Perhaps the Duke's interest had already cooled. Perhaps Genevieve had declined the invitation, or been quietly excluded from the evening's formal proceedings, or been tucked away upstairs in some private study, examining documents, while the real guests enjoyed themselves below. She was halfway through her second glass of champagne and deep in conversation with Lady Whitmore about the upcoming season when the ballroom doors at the far end of the room opened. The string quartet stopped playing. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. Duke Henry of Ravenswood stood in the doorway in full evening dress, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, a single emerald pin at his cravat that caught the light like a green star. His bearing was effortless and commanding, the posture of a man who had grown up in rooms exactly like this one and understood their power without being impressed by it. And on his arm, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his elbow, stood Genevieve Vance. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, simple in cut, extraordinary in effect. The fabric was a fine wool crepe that moved like water when she walked, and at her throat hung a single pendant of polished amber on a thin gold chain that Araminta had never seen before. Her hair was gathered in a low arrangement at the nape of her neck, held in place by two silver pins that looked, on closer inspection, remarkably like miniature bone folders. She looked magnificent. She looked like she had always belonged here and had simply been waiting for the right door to open. Henry guided her into the room with the unhurried confidence of a man presenting the most important person at his own gathering. He did not glance around for approval. He did not make a speech or a declaration. He simply walked with Genevieve through the center of the ballroom, pausing to introduce her to each cluster of guests they passed. "Professor Harding, may I present Miss Genevieve Vance, Chief Conservator and the foremost manuscript restorer working in England today. Miss Vance restored the Blackwood folio. I believe you wrote about it in your last monograph. Lord and Lady Ashcroft, this is Miss Vance. She has been examining the Ravenswood collection this past week, and her findings have already reshaped my understanding of our family's own archive. Every introduction was precise, generous, and delivered with the unmistakable warmth of a man who was proud, deeply, genuinely proud, of the woman beside him." Araminta stood frozen near the window, her champagne glass suspended at mid-height, watching her elder sister move through the most exclusive gathering in London, on the arm of a duke who looked at her as though she were the only person in the room worth knowing. The ivory silk gown, the rehearsed conversations, the careful strategy, all of it dissolved in the space of 30 seconds, washed away by a truth so simple and so devastating that Araminta could not think of a single clever thing to say about it. Genevieve had not been tucked into a corner. She had not been relegated to the service door. She had walked through the front entrance of the finest house on Berkeley Square, and the most powerful man in the room had held the door open for her. The evening unfolded around Genevieve like a landscape she had never expected to inhabit. She had attended precisely 2 formal social gatherings in the past decade, both professional receptions hosted by the British Museum's Manuscript Division, where she had stood near the refreshment table, spoken briefly with 3 or 4 colleagues, and left before the speeches began. She understood conservation. She understood parchment and ink and the silent language of centuries-old documents. She did not understand ballrooms, and yet here, in this candlelit room, full of titled strangers and distinguished scholars, something unexpected was happening. People were listening to her. Professor Harding, a gray-haired medievalist from Cambridge, whose published work Genevieve had been reading since she was 19, engaged her in a 15-minute conversation about the degradation patterns of iron gall ink on Northern European parchment, and concluded by asking whether she would consider presenting a paper at the university's annual conservation symposium. Lord Ashcroft, whose family had owned a significant collection of Tudor-era estate records, asked detailed questions about preventive storage techniques and took notes on the back of his program card. The Countess of Wexford, a woman whose name appeared regularly in the society pages, and whom Genevieve would have expected to have no interest whatsoever in manuscript restoration, turned out to possess a sharp and genuine fascination with medieval women's literacy, and spent 20 minutes asking Genevieve about the marginalia she had encountered in her work. Henry stayed close throughout the evening, though he did not hover. He introduced Genevieve to each new group, provided context where needed, and then stepped back to let her speak. He understood something that most people in his position did not, that Genevieve's authority came from her knowledge, and the best thing he could do was clear the path and let her walk it. By 10 o'clock, Genevieve had spoken with more people in a single evening than she typically encountered in a month. Her face ached slightly from smiling, genuine smiles, the kind that happened without planning, and she felt a warmth in her chest that she recognized, after some consideration, as happiness. She was standing near the manuscript display cases with Henry and Professor Harding, examining a 15th century book of Hours that Henry had loaned from the Ravenswood collection, when Araminta appeared. She had been circling the periphery of the gathering for the past hour, moving between conversation groups with the practiced grace of a woman who knew how to enter a room, but was discovering, for the first time, what it felt like when the room did not particularly care that she had. Sir Reginald had long since retreated to a card table in the adjacent parlor with 2 baronets and a glass of port. Araminta was operating alone. She approached the display case with a glass of champagne in one hand and a smile that had been sharpened to a fine edge over the course of the evening. Her ivory gown caught the candlelight beautifully. Her posture was perfect. Every element of her appearance had been assembled with meticulous care, and the overall effect was that of a porcelain figurine, exquisite, flawless, and entirely hollow. "What a charming exhibition," Araminta said, positioning herself at the edge of the group. Her voice carried the bright, musical quality she deployed in social situations, warm enough to sound friendly, loud enough to ensure the surrounding guests could hear. "I must confess, I know very little about old books, but I do so admire people who dedicate their lives to such quiet, humble work." She turned her gaze directly to Genevieve. "It must be wonderful for you, Genevieve, to have an evening like this. Such a change from your little workshop. I imagine you do not often find yourself among company of this caliber." The words were perfectly chosen, admiring on the surface, corrosive underneath. A compliment with a blade sewn into its lining. Several nearby guests glanced over, sensing the shift in temperature. Genevieve opened her mouth to respond, but Henry spoke first. "Actually, Lady Croft," he said, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone he had used all evening, though something in its register had dropped by a fraction. "I was just about to address the room regarding Miss Vance's contributions to the Ravenswood collection. Your timing is impeccable. Please, stay." He turned and walked toward the center of the ballroom. The string quartet, recognizing the signal, brought their current piece to a close. The murmur of conversation faded as Henry positioned himself before the fireplace, where the light was strongest and every face in the room could see him clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "thank you for joining me this evening. I invited you here to celebrate something I believe deserves wider recognition: the extraordinary and largely unacknowledged work of manuscript conservation." He paused, letting the room settle into full attention. Many of you are familiar with the Blackwood Folio, the 15th century trade manuscript that was restored 3 years ago after being declared beyond salvage by every professional conservator in London. The restoration was performed anonymously, and I spent considerable time attempting to identify the artisan responsible. I can now tell you that the restorer of the Blackwood Folio is Miss Genevieve Vance, who is with us tonight. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. Professor Harding nodded slowly, as though a long-held suspicion had just been confirmed. The Countess of Wexford turned to look at Genevieve with undisguised admiration. "Miss Vance has also recently completed the stabilization and restoration of a 14th century royal charter from my family's collection, a document of significant historical importance. During the course of that restoration, the charter was subjected to a deliberate act of sabotage." The room went very still. An individual entered Miss Vance's workshop under false pretenses and poured ink across the surface of a 600-year-old document in an attempt to destroy both the charter and Miss Vance's professional reputation. Henry's voice remained steady, but his eyes had taken on the hard, clear quality of polished steel. He was not angry. He was something more precise than angry. He was delivering a verdict. Miss Vance spent 9 consecutive hours removing the ink, using techniques she developed herself, saving the charter entirely, and preserving forensic evidence of the sabotage, including a scented residue on the protective covering that identified the individual responsible. He did not look at Araminta. He did not need to. Every person in the room who knew the Vance family, and there were enough of them, had already followed the thread to its conclusion. The silence that filled the ballroom was dense and absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a judgment that has already been passed. "I share this with you tonight," Henry continued, "because the world of conservation is built on trust. Collectors entrust restorers with irreplaceable artifacts. Restorers dedicate their lives to preserving the records of our shared history. When that trust is attacked, when someone attempts to destroy another person's work and livelihood out of personal malice, it is an offense against the entire community gathered in this room. He turned and looked directly at Genevieve. Miss Vance is the most gifted conservator I have ever encountered. She has dedicated her career to preserving documents that the rest of us would have allowed to crumble into dust. She deserves the recognition and respect of every person here tonight, and I am honored to have her as my guest. The applause began with Professor Harding and spread quickly through the room. Genuine, sustained applause of the kind that London's drawing rooms rarely produced, because it was driven by respect rather than obligation. Genevieve stood near the display cases, her hands clasped together, her chin level, her eyes bright. She did not cry. She did not make a speech. She accepted the recognition the way she accepted everything, with composure, with grace, and with the quiet certainty of a woman who had always known her own worth, even when the world had refused to acknowledge it. Araminta did not move during the applause. She stood precisely where Henry's words had pinned her, at the edge of the group, her champagne glass still in her hand, her ivory gown still catching the candlelight, her face arranged in an expression that might have been mistaken for composure by anyone who was not looking carefully. But the guests nearest to her had already begun to shift. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement, the way a crowd rearranges itself around someone who has been quietly excluded from its center. No one said anything directly. No one confronted her or accused her or raised their voice. They simply turned away. One by one, conversation by conversation, glance by glance, the room closed itself around Araminta like a door being shut by polite, invisible hands. By 11 o'clock, she and Sir Reginald were in their carriage, riding home through the darkened streets of Mayfair in complete silence. Araminta stared out the window at the passing gas lamps, each one throwing a brief circle of amber light across her face before plunging her back into shadow. She had come to this evening expecting to watch her sister be diminished. Instead, she had watched her sister be celebrated by the most powerful room in London, while she herself stood at its margins, surrounded by turned backs and averted eyes. Sir Reginald, for once, had the wisdom not to speak. The carriage rattled on through the empty streets, carrying them home to a house that already felt smaller than it had that morning. 7 days passed before Genevieve returned to Ravenswood Abbey. She had spent the week after the soirée in her workshop, completing the final stages of the charter restoration, the careful pressing, the application of a thin protective facing to the most vulnerable areas, the reinforcement of the pendant seal cords with new silk thread twisted to match the original braid pattern. The work required patience and steady hands, and Genevieve was grateful for both, because the rest of her was in a state of quiet upheaval that she did not entirely know how to manage. Henry's letter arrived on the 23rd day. It was brief, written in his own hand rather than dictated to a secretary, and it contained none of the elaborate courtesies that typically padded aristocratic correspondence. Dear Genevieve, the conservatory has something I would like you to see. It concerns a book, though I confess the book is largely an excuse. Will you come on Thursday? Yours, Henry. She read the letter 4 times. She noted the word yours and the absence of his title. She folded the paper carefully along its original creases and placed it inside the cover of her notebook, where it rested against the page containing her restoration notes for the charter. Then she packed her traveling case and arranged a seat on the Thursday morning coach to Oxfordshire. The weather had turned during the week. The mild autumn warmth that had accompanied her first visit to Ravenswood had given way to something cooler and sharper, with a pale sky and a wind that carried the first faint promise of winter. The trees along the approach road had begun to turn, scattered patches of gold and copper among the green. and fallen leaves gathered in small drifts against the limestone walls of the gatehouse. Henry met her at the entrance again, though this time he was wearing a heavier coat and had a wool scarf wound loosely around his neck. He looked slightly different from the man who had commanded the ballroom at Ravenswood House a week ago, less formal, less composed, more human. There was something in his expression that Genevieve had not seen before, a nervousness, carefully managed, visible only in the way his hands stayed in his coat pockets a fraction too long, before he extended one to help her down from the carriage. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I realize Thursday was short notice." "You mentioned a book," Genevieve said. "I have never required more than a book to justify a journey." Henry smiled at that, a quick, warm expression that came and went like sunlight through a passing cloud. "Then follow me. It is in the conservatory." He led her through the main house, past the library where they had spent those 2 extraordinary days cataloging the collection, and through a glass-paned door at the end of the south corridor that opened into the conservatory. Genevieve had not seen this room during her previous visit. It was a long, elegant glass structure attached to the southern face of the abbey, with an iron framework supporting tall panes that let in the pale October light from every angle. The room was filled with plants, ferns in large ceramic pots, climbing jasmine trained along the iron supports, a row of orange trees in wooden tubs that scented the air with something faintly sweet and warm, despite the cooling season outside. A stone-flagged path ran the length of the space, and at the far end stood a small round table with 2 chairs, positioned beneath the tallest glass panel where the light was brightest. On the table sat a book. Genevieve walked toward it, drawn by the same instinct that had pulled her toward the damaged binding in the Oakhaven Library 3 weeks ago. The professional reflex that preceded conscious thought. The restorer's compulsion to reach for something old and fragile before anything else in the room registered. The volume was small, octavo size, perhaps 6 inches by 4, bound in soft brown calfskin that had aged to a warm chestnut. The binding was intact, but worn, with the gentle rounding at the spine edges that came from decades of careful handling. She could tell before touching it that this book had been loved by someone, held often, opened and closed with the kind of habitual tenderness that left its signature in the leather. She picked it up and opened the front cover. The end papers were marbled, a Dutch pattern in blue and gold that she recognized as early 18th century. The title page was handwritten in a fine italic hand, a collection of pressings from the gardens at Ravenswood Abbey, begun in the year 1742 by Eleanor Catherine Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenswood. Genevieve turned the pages slowly. Each leaf held a pressed flower, or botanical specimen, flattened and dried and mounted with small strips of linen tape. Beneath each specimen, in the same elegant hand, was a notation, the plant's common name, its Latin classification, the date it was collected, and the location in the abbey grounds where it had been found. Lavandula angustifolia, garden lavender, collected from the south terrace wall, June 1743. Rosa damascena, damask rose. From the walled garden, first bloom of the season, May 1744. The pages went on, dozens of specimens, spanning years, each one preserved with the meticulous care of someone who understood that beauty was worth documenting and that small things mattered. "My great-great-grandmother," Henry said. He was standing a few paces behind her, watching her turn the pages. "She started this collection the year after the library was founded. The book has been kept in a drawer in the conservatory ever since. I found it last spring during an inventory and realized it had never been properly examined or conserved." Genevieve reached a page near the middle of the book and stopped. A small sprig of forget-me-not had been pressed there. Its blue petals faded to a pale ghost of their original color, but still intact. still holding their shape after nearly a century of quiet preservation. Beneath it, the Duchess had written, Myosotis sylvatica, wood forget-me-not, given to me by my husband on the occasion of our 20th year together. He said he chose it because its name was a promise. Genevieve's breath caught. She stared at the tiny blue flowers and the handwritten words beneath them and felt something open inside her chest, something she had kept locked for so long that she had forgotten it was there. Genevieve. She turned. Henry had moved closer. He stood less than 2 feet from her, his hands no longer in his pockets, his expression no longer hidden behind the careful composure of a duke addressing his peers. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something important and then decided, at the final moment, to abandon the rehearsal entirely and speak plainly. I have spent 20 years managing an estate, maintaining a title, and navigating a world that measures people by their lineage, their fortune, and their ability to perform well at dinner parties, he said. I have been introduced to every eligible woman in England, by every determined mother, in every drawing room, from here to Edinburgh. And in all those years, across all those rooms and all those introductions, I have never once met a person who made me want to stay in the conversation. He paused. His voice, when he continued, was quieter. Stripped of performance, stripped of strategy, stripped of everything except the words themselves. Until I walked into a dusty library at a wedding I did not want to attend and found a woman repairing a book that no one else in the house even knew existed. Genevieve held the pressed flower book against her chest with both hands, the way a person holds something precious when they are afraid of dropping it. I am not asking you to give up your workshop, Henry said. I am not asking you to abandon your work or your independence or the life you have built entirely on your own strength. I am asking you to let me be part of it. As your husband, as your partner, and as someone who will spend the rest of his life making certain that you never again have to sit at the second table. The conservatory was very quiet. The October light fell through the glass in pale, slanting columns, illuminating the ferns and the orange trees and the 2 people standing between them. Outside, a breeze moved through the turning leaves, and somewhere in the Abbey grounds, a blackbird was singing the clear, bright song it always sang in the last warm days before winter arrived. Genevieve looked at the man standing before her. This duke, who had searched 3 years for an anonymous restorer, who had sat in her workshop and read her notebooks, who had held her hand on a windowsill at dusk without needing to fill the silence with words. She thought about the library upstairs, with its 300 uncatalogued manuscripts waiting to be examined. She thought about the charter, now fully restored, its 600-year-old text, preserved for another 600 more. She thought about the spinning wheel, still sitting on a nightstand in a guest room at Oakhaven Manor, given as a weapon, and rendered meaningless by everything that had followed. Yes, she said. Henry exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though he had been holding it for considerably longer than this conversation. Genevieve set the pressed flower book gently on the table, reached up, and placed her hands on either side of his face. His skin was warm beneath her palms. He covered her hands with his own and held them there. I should warn you, Genevieve said, and for the first time since the day of the wedding, her voice carried a tremor, small, barely detectable, like a hairline crack in the surface of a very old, very strong piece of parchment. I am a difficult woman to live with. I keep cold rooms. I stay up all night working. I care more about 15th century binding techniques than I do about table seating arrangements, and I will always choose a damaged manuscript over a dinner party. Henry leaned forward until his forehead rested gently against hers. Genevieve, he said, that is precisely why I asked. The blackbird sang on, the autumn light held steady, and in a glass room full of growing things, surrounded by the quiet persistence of roots and leaves and pressed flowers that had outlasted the century that made them, two people who had spent their lives preserving the past began, together, to build a future. In the years that followed, the Duchess of Ravenswood became the most celebrated conservator in England. The Ravenswood Library, fully catalogued and restored under her direction, was open to scholars from across Europe. The pressed flower book of Eleanor Catherine Blackwood was given a place of honor in the conservatory, where visitors often paused to read the inscription beneath the forget-me-not. Araminta and Sir Reginald lived quietly in Mayfair. They were not shunned. Society was too polite for that. But they were no longer sought. Invitations grew thinner. Drawing rooms grew smaller, and the spinning wheel, which a maid had eventually found on the nightstand at Oakhaven Manor, was sent to a curiosity shop in Camden, where it sat in a window, gathering the very dust its giver had once mocked. Genevieve never mentioned it again. She had far more important things to do with her hands.